Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 8. Remember, we're already on Chapter 8 because we're not doing the chapters in order of the book. We're doing the chapters in the order of the media as it appeared. And after books come newspapers. So today is newspaper day. Here's a newspaper from Caesar's Times. You can tell it's very heavy. No pictures. Would have been very difficult to have a paper route back then. The first Colonial paper showed up in 1690, Public Occurrences, and it was very gossipy, which, would be like the People magazine of today. The Boston newsletter is mentioned in your book. One of the things that's interesting about it is that it listed public floggings and illnesses. And that sounds creepy, but really, if you think about it now, it's maybe that was the 1704 version of TMZ, right? Lots of drama and gossip. It also had old news from Europe. And the reason that it was old news is that, remember, back then it took weeks for news to get over here from Europe. So your book mentions the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was started by Ben Franklin. And he was so smart. What he did was sell space in his newspaper to advertisers. So like before, there were partisan papers where they made their money just from selling, right? Selling on the subscriptions or people buying the paper from a person on the corner. Commercial papers, like Ben Franklin's, made money through advertising. And of course, that's primarily what we have now. The paper circulation in the US, only the biggest paper only had 1,500. How come? Well, the infrastructure back then was such that it would be very difficult to deliver papers to the frontier. Okay, we didn't have the infrastructure road system that we have now. And also, the literacy rate was really, really low then. We weren't super educated. So there weren't as many people who wanted to read the news. And remember, back then, if you wanted news, this was your source. Newspapers were your source, besides talking to people. So here we're moving forward in time. We have cheaper paper plus a higher literacy rate. More newspapers are going to be generated. Penny papers, of course, they cost a penny. New York Sun was one of the first and the most famous. They did a lot of scandals and serialized stories. That meant that they would start a story in one paper and maybe leave it with a cliffhanger, kind of like TV shows, right? And then you'd have to buy the next paper to find out what happens next in the story. So pretty clever. They were also the first to include celebrity news. So our obsession with celebrities dates back hundreds of years. So wire services are something that you absolutely need to be aware of. And a wire service, actually the first one was started in 1848. Instead of 6 New York newspapers sending a reporter to cover the Civil War, for example, they would form like a co-op or a club and say, okay, we are going to together send one reporter, and then we're all going to use that story. So this was actually a really, really smart idea. So the 3 big wire services, Associated Press, Reuters, which is like the Associated Press of Europe, and UPI, United Press International. There's pros and cons to a wire service. The pro, if you're a newspaper owner, is that you don't have to pay to send reporters around the world. You can join the Associated Press and use stories from Associated Press reporters, right? Okay. But the con, like if you look, in fact, in class, we're going to actually look at a St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You'll see 90% of the stories in the paper are from the Associated Press, which you can get from the AP website, right? So there's pros and cons. One interesting thing about UPI is that it was actually started using carrier pigeons. That's how they got stories to the papers. They put them in carrier pigeons, which I think is fascinating. So now we're getting a little more current with Joseph Pulitzer. You are probably very familiar with his last name. The Pulitzer Prizes are named after him. They're like the Oscars for reporting and newspaper and news work. He bought the St. Louis Post, merged it with the St. Louis Dispatch, so it became the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You might not know that St. Louis used to have 2 daily papers. The Globe Democrat was the conservative paper, and the Post-Dispatch was the more liberal paper. And the way that you could tell is by what they put in their editorial sections, in their opinion sections, okay? The Post-Dispatch used to be in the morning. The Globe Democrat used to come out. I'm sorry, Post-Dispatch in the morning. Wait, no. The Globe Democrat was in the morning, and the Post-Dispatch was in the afternoon. When the Globe Democrat went out of business, the Post-Dispatch moved to the morning. Okay. Now, what he did was really clever. He was the first newspaper guy to target women. So he included advice columns, he included recipes, he included fashion news, okay? And what's really smart is that he knew that women made a lot of the purchasing decisions. So you want to target ads to them, right? Because they're the ones that are making all these decisions. And so he included department store advertising. And even now, if you pick up a newspaper, in many cases, you're going to see a full-page ad from Macy's. So it continues even now. Now, if you've seen the movie Citizen Kane, you're familiar with the William Randolph Hearst story. He was a huge tycoon, had a gazillion newspapers in his media empire. His whole thing was sensation, sensation, sensation. Big headlines, simple layouts, right? And this is my favorite quote of his. And if you've seen this GIF, it's actually from Citizen Kane. The modern editor does not care for facts. The editor wants novelty. What that means essentially is give me something new. Don't tell me the same story anymore. I want novelty. I want new stories. I want something that no one's heard before and that no other newspaper is going to do. And he was super rich. He was crazy rich for his day. Okay. So now we're moving forward to Adolph Ochs. He bought the New York Times in 1896. Now, his mentality about news was totally different than Hearst's. He wanted to focus on the news, not sensationalism or celebrities. Okay. If you've taken a media writing course, you most likely have heard of the pyramid, the inverted pyramid of writing. This was from Adolph Ochs. This is what he gave his reporters when he wanted them to just focus on the facts of the story. So what we're experiencing now in the newspaper industry is, I don't want to say it's death throes, but there's really not much growth, as you can imagine. And something else that's interesting is that it used to be, and this chart just shows you, 20 years ago, 50 companies owned most of the media in the country, and now that has dropped to 5. And we'll talk about this later in the semester, but there's effects of all of our media being owned by these huge multinational, publicly traded conglomerates, because clearly they're not interested in risk and they're most interested in profit. Okay. These are national papers. There's 2 main national papers, although I think many people would consider the New York Times a national paper, the Wall Street Journal and the USA Today. The Wall Street Journal is one of the few newspapers that actually has an increasing circulation. It is a conservative paper, meaning that its news stories are objective, but the opinion section and like the editorial sections lean more pro-business. It's the Wall Street Journal, of course. USA Today has increased circulation because, remember, anytime you stay in a hotel, they give you a USA Today. And USA Today was one of the first newspapers to actually use color photos and lots of charts. People, when it came out in the 80s, people actually referred to it as Mick paper because they thought it was dumbing down the news. The New York Times is written at an 8th grade reading level, so I don't know how it can get much lower than that. But there's narrowcasted papers also. Remember, we talked about broadcasting, narrowcasting, and microcasting. There's narrowcasted papers also, like the St. Louis American, targets the Black community here, and there's a newspaper for the Bosnian community here as well. And I think we could say the Riverfront Times is fairly narrowcasted also. So when we're in class, I'm going to do a fun Kahoot asking you what your attitudes are about news, so we can talk about that. But there's some terms that I want you to know. One of them is hypercommercialism. This means that ads are now on the front page of the paper. That used to be reserved, wholly real estate in the news business. And now it's a free-for-all. If somebody wants to pay for an ad on the front page, they can have it, which demonstrates how the newspapers are desperate for money. There's 2 ways to measure the newspaper's reach. There's circulation, which is typical, the number of copies the paper is sold, but also the integrated audience reach. Let me move my head. There we go. The integrated audience reach. What that is the circulation plus the online readership. Now, you will hear some people say that the dumbest thing that newspapers ever did was put all their content online for free. And I agree. I agree. There are some newspapers that you have to pay to read. They're behind a paywall. Most newspapers are not. So it's interesting that they put all their content on the web, but then complain that their circulation is dropping. Well, as long as the integrated audience reach stays okay, newspapers should be all right. Let's see. And there's lots of layoffs happening, of course. This was just last year, and I imagine because of the pandemic, it will only get worse. And here's a cartoon that kind of explains what I was talking about just now. Print media isn't dead. Go to the website for the whole story. So this was a thread on Twitter, and we're going to spend more time on this later, but this guy's a teacher at Lehigh University, and he basically did a whole thread on the history of the newspaper industry, and it's so good. It's so good. So he says the internet came along, and during this time, newsrooms didn't innovate because they didn't feel like they needed to. Okay, they invested in technology. Well, here he talks about attending a journalism content and hearing publishers boast that newspapers were here to stay. They believed that their product, the paper product, the news, was a product, not a story. Like the newspaper was what they were selling, not the stories. But see, the stories you can tell online, right? So they kind of missed the boat. So now you've got companies with massive debt, and they see their readership shrinking because we're all moving to the web. And then we all started producing our own news, right? I mean, what is it, like 60% of Americans now get their news from Facebook? Okay, so the newspapers aren't as necessary as they used to be. So where newspapers used to make a ton of their money is the classified ads. It used to be entire sections of the Sunday paper would be an employment section, 20 to 30 pages of employment ads. Okay, now that doesn't exist anymore because, well, we'll get to that in a second. Here it is. Free classified ads on Craigslist, among others. People have said Craig Newmark killed newspapers, but that is nonsense. Somebody was going to do it. And I think that's true. But the classified ads were free money for the newspaper industry. And when we could start putting our stuff online for free to sell, why pay for a classified ad, right? And besides, something else that your book doesn't really mention here is that by the time the newspaper arrives in your driveway, if it's delivered, those stories are already 10 hours old. The paper gets put to bed the night before. So if there's a breaking story, you're not going to turn to the newspaper. You might turn to the newspaper for context the next day, but if there's a story breaking, you're on Twitter, you're online, right? So the big question, will newspapers survive? Will the physical newspaper survive? Stories will always survive. There will always be news. But I think the issue is, how will it be delivered to us? And how do we like to consume it now? My parents, my dad's 94. So I grew up watching him consume the news, physically holding a newspaper, right? But now you all consume news right here. So the delivery system has changed, even if the stories necessarily have not. And I want you to think, is Craig Newmark the newspaper killer? And are newspapers just outdated content delivery systems? What can we learn from the history of newspapers and the newspaper business that could possibly help them in the future? So that's newspapers. And the class activity we're doing for newspapers is one of my favorite of the whole year. So get excited, and I will see you on campus, I hope.